Hi, I'm Cort Lindahl. Welcome to Mysteries and Legends of Northern California. In episode 1, we're going to be taking a look at the relationship between Chico, California, and the myths and legends of Mount Shasta.
In 1841, John Bidwell came to California as part of one of the earliest wagon trains to head west from Council Bluffs, Iowa. In leaving Council Bluffs, Bidwell was also leaving a part of his family that had a great impact on the development of that town and state. John Bidwell would become an important pioneer of California. He first worked for John Sutter, famous for Sutter's Mill, and as the site of discovery of gold in California. Later, we may see that John Bidwell had produced a map as early as 1847 that showed the gold-bearing regions of California. Is it possible that Bidwell and others had been taking advantage of this resource before the beginning of the official 1849 gold rush? John Bidwell would later obtain what came to be known as Rancho Arroyo Chico. At this time, California was still part of Mexico. Subsequently, Bidwell would become a general in the California militia and be instrumental in the establishment of the California Bear Flag Republic, and later in California becoming part of the United States. Bidwell created the street plan of Chico in some ways as a miniature of Washington, D.C. and its plan. The original streets of Chico were laid out as an 8x8 block pattern that resembled the chessboard. This included what was to be the Chico City Plaza and what would be the Queen Square. In 1872, using a ceremony similar to that used by Constantine, Bidwell dedicated the city plaza by plowing a circle in the earth. Constantine, in one of his legends, is said to have used the Spear of Destiny to scrape out a line in the earth designating the royal district of Constantinople. What Bidwell had done was to create an axis mundi, or symbol of temporal control, that included directions that had talismanic importance in the tradition of Constantine and the Towers of the Winds of Athens. This type of classic veneration and dynamic was not unusual for 19th century society. This era was in some ways the golden age of Freemasonry in the United States. The story of the Hooker Oak reveals a great deal about the family legacy of John Bidwell and how we may be led to Mount Shasta via these connections. The name of the Hooker Oak, regardless of the origins of the name, indicates a symbolic message from John Bidwell as to his family legacies. John Bidwell's biography includes his family's origins in the colonies as part of the original settlers of Hartford, Connecticut. A monument in Hartford attests to this. The leader of this group of colonists was named Reverend Thomas Hooker. Reverend Hooker and J.D. Hooker were from the same family in Old England. It appears he and John Bidwell were aware of this relation. In fact, the two families were related via a web of intermarriage in early Hartford. The history of Connecticut involves the story of the Charter Oak. Soon after Hartford was founded, the colonists were granted a charter by King James I that gave them an unusual amount of liberties compared to some of the other colonies. Later, during the era of King James II, it was decided to revoke the Connecticut charter in favor of a charter benefiting the king more. In response, the charter document was taken and hidden in an oak tree in Hartford so it could not be confiscated by the new governor of New England. The charter was actually taken and hidden in the oak tree by a direct ancestor of famous poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, named Joseph Wadsworth. Poet Longfellow also played a major role in deciphering the mysteries of North America. He too would take part in a similar legacy we see being displayed by John Bidwell. Here in the story of the Hooker Oak, we are being given a somewhat veiled reference to the Connecticut heritage of John Bidwell and J.D. Hooker in the naming of an oak tree in Chico, California. It appears as if the story of the Hooker Oak is cluing us into the real origins of the Bidwell and Hooker families. Other prominent names included on the Hartford Founders Monument include Bacon, Olcott, Lewis, Adams, Allen, Arnold, Beale, Robert Beale, associate of Bacon, Beale treasure family, Chaplin, Easton, Hale, Hart, Hill, Marsh, also a prominent Chico family, Olmsted, Scott, Smith, Wadsworth, Longfellow, and White. Within this list of names are a few families who would produce members that had a great impact on the spiritual values of the United States. The Bidwells and associated Hartford families hold quite a legacy in the creation of new ways of faith that reflected the values of the new country. John Bidwell's English ancestors included Knights Templar Ormus Legaidon, the standard bearer. Ormus heritage in turn included an ancestry that linked to Charlemagne and all the Latin kings of Jerusalem. Ormus was the seed of the Bidwell family in England. Ormus was known for having brought some of the earliest Byzantine stonemasons to come from the Levant to England. This may have included the famous Ashmore family of Ashmolean Museum fame. These stonemasons built two of the earliest churches in Staffordshire, England. St. Chad's Church in Stafford includes a founder's inscription stating Ormus had built the church. This inscription contains the Auspice of Maria symbol that is representative of the three letters AVM, or Ave Maria. One of John Bidwell's ancestors from the Elizabethan age was Middle Eastern explorer and merchant William Biddulph. The Biddulph name of England evolved into the newer English and American Bidwell name. William Biddulph was one of the individuals who wrote portions of the King James Bible. John Bidwell is directly related via at least 3 marriages in early Hartford and environs to the family of Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon faith. Bidwell is related in the same way to the family of Henry Steele Olcott, co-founder of the Theosophical Society and partner of famous Madame Blavatsky. Another Hartford founding family, the Lewis, who are related to famous explorer Meriwether Lewis as well as John Bidwell. This Hartford family would also eventually produce Harvey Spencer Lewis, founder of the American Rosicrucian Order in San Jose, California. Bidwell also held a close family tie to the Ballard family of Guy Ballard, who founded the I Am activity at Mount Shasta. In addition, we see members of the Hill and Lewis family being involved in other similar exploits in Williamsburg, Virginia, and then later in Minnesota. This same family group may be behind many of the mysteries of North America, including Oak Island, the Newport Tower, the Beale Treasure, Bacon's Vault in Williamsburg, and the Kensington Rune. At each site, the mystery of the involvement of these first families is evident. All of these relations, though not direct to John Bidwell, show intermarriage with the Bidwell family through time. Is it possible that this family group had worked through time to create new versions of faith that seemed to accommodate the American ideal?
Okay, we've learned a lot about all of the family relations of John Bidwell and their strange connections to Mount Shasta, but in more detail, it's very interesting that Harvey Spencer Lewis, the founder of the Rosicrucian Order in San Jose, is so closely related to John Bidwell. We see the whole Rosicrucian Order being involved in propagating many of the myths of the hollow earth or cities beneath Mount Shasta, possibly Telos, and then some of the other theosophical overtones of the Rosicrucian Order links us to Henry Steele Olcott, and it's just really terribly interesting that John Bidwell is related to him. Henry Olcott was also an investigator into the Lincoln assassination, which we'll cover in subsequent episodes and other works I've done concerning Washington, D.C. and the White House Meridian, but it's really interesting that he's kind of involved in this creation of a new way of faith and a new way of thinking with Madame Blavatsky. I mean, really, we have one of the most well-known figures of New Age thought being related to John Bidwell. So this is an incredible association, along with his family crossover with Guy Ballard as well. All of this really boils down to possibly a family group that had dedicated themselves to forming new ways of faith in opposition to the more traditional forms, and more specifically the Catholic Church. So it's very interesting that he's related to these people. And what we see is Henry Steele Olcott and Guy Ballard kind of promoted theosophical concepts at Mount Shasta that were developed, by this international group of people and the families that harken all the way back to the Oak Island mystery, the Kensington Rune stone, and other places of mystery in the United States like Williamsburg and Washington, D.C. Okay, John Bidwell established an Axis Mundi in Chico at the City Plaza, where the foundation stone of Chico is also located. To the northwest, the City Plaza points to approximately 319 degrees to the old Bank of America building that includes a lot of classical imagery that may be suggestive of a theme, and the line also crosses right over a mural of John and Annie Bidwell. As the line progresses to the northwest, it crosses the old Masonic Lodge that is now the Blue Room Theater, and continues to the newer Chico Labyrinth and Children's Park, right next to the church that John Bidwell had built. The line extends to Bidwell Mansion and the Gateway Science Museum as well. The logo of the Gateway Science Museum may contain the AVM symbol, just as the diamond finial of the Senator Theater that is part of the array of the City Plaza. The symbol is present in many mysteries and interesting situations involving the family or blood that I believe arranged all of these geographic mysteries in Chico and at Mount Shasta. Now, the original 8x8 block plan of Chico does resemble the original city limits of Washington, D.C. in its square or diamond-shaped form. And we do see the chessboard imagery in the Chico City Plaza. But ultimately, we see the plaza pointing to the former property of California pioneer Peter Lassen, who established Benton City. Later, Stanford would own the property, and the monastery of New Clairvaux would eventually get the property in a donation from Stanford University. Now, currently, in the 1930s, William Randolph Hearst had elements of the monastery of Santa Maria de Avila shipped to California. There, the chapter house of the monastery is currently being rebuilt at the monastery of New Clairvaux. It's a very interesting site. You can see 12th century Masons marks right here in Northern California. The Chico City Plaza points to the property of the monastery, but this alignment was probably originally meant to point to John Bidwell's friend Peter Lassen's city, named Benton City, after Missouri Senator Benton. Again, to recap, we're finding that John Bidwell is related to William Bidulph, who produced part of the King James Version of the Bible. He's related to Henry Steele Olcott, who created Theosophy with Madame Blavatsky and others, kind of a new way of thought based on Eastern concepts such as the Ascended Masters. And we see that being applied later at Mount Shasta by Guy Ballard and his group, the I Am activity. All of that is based on the possibility that Guy Ballard had an encounter with Saint Germain on the slopes of Mount Shasta and was himself evolved into an ascended master status himself. So his whole faith is based on that. And it's terribly interesting that the I Am activity now owns Shasta Springs Resort, which I feel was a place where one of these octagonal axes were placed in a series of mysteries placed along the railroads by the owners of the Great Northern Railroad, who are from Minneapolis, Minnesota and Alexandria, Minnesota, and may have planned the Kensington Rune stone mystery in this tradition. Well, part of what we're seeing here is the creation of an axis mundi, or possibly a personal meridian, as Thomas Jefferson would term it. We've discussed the family relation between Harvey Spencer Lewis and John Bidwell. We know Lewis created the AMORC headquarters, or Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose, and his grave is there marked by a small pyramid. Here we actually see the octagon next to Harvey Spencer Lewis's grave that also matches the orientation of the entire block where the Rosicrucian Museum is located, points to the Chico City Plaza, another axis mundi created by John Bidwell. So it is either a grand coincidence that this geographic relationship exists, or it's possible that Mr. Lewis knew of his relation to John Bidwell and orientated his facility to point this way. Here we can see the octagon right next to the pyramid marking Lewis's grave, points to the Chico City Plaza, created in the tradition of Constantine the Great by Chico founder John Bidwell. The Chico City Plaza also points some interesting directions, which we'll examine later. Well, it's also interesting that the tradition of the axis mundi sometimes dictates that its creator is buried beneath that point on the earth. Indeed, here we see Lewis being buried right at the center of his axis, possibly, that he created. And there are persistent rumors in Chico that John Bidwell is indeed buried beneath the city plaza. The entire concept of the Axis Mundi explains why this rumor could be true. In 1872, J.D. Hooker visited Chico. This is coincidentally the same year that the Chico City Plaza was dedicated by John Bidwell. On the second trip to Chico in 1877, J.D. Hooker went on a trip to Mount Shasta with John and Annie Bidwell, John Muir, and Harvard botanist Asa Gray. Asa Gray and J.D. Hooker were both part of the Linnean Society of London. During their trip to Shasta, they stayed at Sisson's and in a camp up on the slopes of Mount Shasta that Sisson had arranged for them. It was during this time that J.D. Hooker revealed his experiences in the Himalayas and the Far East, thus giving us a distant early first connection to Mount Shasta and Eastern concepts. This is possible and may have something to do with the later lore of Mount Shasta. It is just speculation that J.D. Hooker knew about any of the mystical concepts that would be applied to Mount Shasta. What is known is that in 1885, Frederick Oliver wrote a book called A Dweller on Two Planets that introduced many of the concepts to the Mount Shasta area that we see today. Interestingly, in turn, many of these concepts echo Native American myths and legends of the mountain. Here we are at Sisson's, one time visited by John Bidwell and some scholars from the Linnean Society of London, including John Hooker, who the Hooker Oak is named for in Chico. So this is the site of one of the earliest trading posts in the area. Later we would have MacLeod come and found Dunsmuir, who's named for railroad magnate Dunsmuir. And in Scots Gaelic, Dunsmuir means fortress of Muir. So that's an interesting connection even to the family of John Muir and others who came to Mount Shasta at an early time, including elements of the Hudson's Bay Company, including the Lockhart family, who took part in the Battle of Tebba, in which James Douglas took the heart of Robert the Bruce into battle. So here we are at Sisson's, and there's this beautiful memorial here marking it, and the building you see in the background there is a remnant of the trading post that was here that's been modernized and preserved. So what we have here is a historical marker marking the location of Sisson's Ranch. That was quite a destination for the elite of San Francisco in the late 19th century. So Mount Shasta used to have kind of this elite association with it. It's only a train ride away from the Bay Area, and lots of people came up here, including Lord Caldray. And that's one of the only things I see. He may have built the tunnels in Dunsmuir to facilitate the spring water being used by the town. So that's an interesting aspect to what could have been blown into a myth or legend later as an entrance to Lemuria. So there's lots of elite kind of overtones here of occult happenings and intentionally created mythology on the parts of different groups of people. And we even find the legacy of the possible state of Jefferson that is being considered in Northern California and Southern Oregon.
The Indians say the Great Spirit made this mountain first of all. Can you not see how it is, they say? He first pushed down snow and ice from the skies through a hole which he made in the blue heavens by turning a stone round and round, till he made this great mountain. Then he stepped out of the clouds onto the mountain top and descended and planted the trees all around by putting his finger on the ground. Simple and sublime. The sun melted the snow, and the water ran down and nurtured the trees and made the rivers. After that, he made the fish for the rivers out of the small end of his staff. He made the birds by blowing some leaves which he took up from the ground among the trees. After that, he made the beasts out of the remainder of his stick, but made the grizzly bear out of the big end, and made him master over all the others. He made the grizzly so strong that he feared him himself and would have to go up on the top of the mountain out of sight of the forest to sleep at night, lest the grizzly, who, as will be seen, was much more strong and cunning than now, should assail him in his sleep. Afterwards, the Great Spirit, wishing to remain on earth and make the sea and some more land, he converted Mount Shasta by a great deal of labor into a wigwam and built the fire in the center of it and made it a pleasant home. After that, his family came down, and they all have lived in the mountain ever since. They say that before the white man came, they could see the fire ascending from the mountain by night and the smoke by day every time they chose to look in that direction.
Thanks a lot for joining me for episode 1 of Mysteries and Legends of Northern California. Here we've laid a groundwork for understanding how Chico is related to Mount Shasta. Next time we'll see how these connections tie in more to the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto and the Heights Estate in Oakland of poet of the Sierras Joaquin Miller. Joaquin Miller had an interesting impact on the development of Mount Shasta, and he hobnobbed with some interesting people in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in Europe, and then returned and lived on the White House Meridian in Washington, D.C. for 2 years before returning to Oakland and building his pyramid due south of the peak of Mount Shasta. We'll also take a look at the involvement of John Muir and the Dunsmuir family. So thanks for being here, and please come back and see us again. The mysteries are waiting, and we're going to see how everything in the Bay Area connects to Mount Shasta as well. And in future episodes, we're also going to be taking a look at the more quote standard myths and legends of Mount Shasta, including the legend of J.C. Brown and all of the mythology of cities and the hollow earth having to do with Mount Shasta. So thanks for joining me. I'm Cort Lindahl. Stay tuned for more. Welcome to Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Mount Shasta Revealed. I'm your host, Cort Lindahl. Here in episode 4, we're going to put together a lot of the mysteries we've been looking at and see how the Chico area relates to the legacy of Sir Francis Bacon and the strange street plan of Washington, D.C.
The diamond chessboard plan of Chico is a key factor to consider when looking at the alternate or hidden history of Northern California. In the past, we have speculated that the plan of Chico was a reference to the diamond-shaped plan of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was planned by famous Society of the Cincinnati member Pierre L'Enfant, along with a panel that consisted of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and a man named Andrew Ellicott. Ellicott was one of the premier astronomers and land surveyors of the Revolutionary War period and beyond. Some of his direct ancestors had made swords for the staff of General Washington, while other ancestors had been astronomers and famous clockmakers in England prior to the family coming to the United States. Andrew Ellicott was the man who originally surveyed the diamond-shaped 10-mile square of the original District of Columbia. He and his crew had been the actual individuals to have installed the stone boundary markers denoting the District of Columbia that can be seen to this day. Ellicott is also noted for having an African-American man named Benjamin Banneker help him with the astronomical calculations that aided in the accurate placement of the boundary and its associated stones. Ellicott would also go on to finish the design of the streets after L'Enfant withdrew his skills in this task. In addition to the boundaries of the city, Andrew Ellicott was the man who actually laid out the original street plan of Washington District of Columbia that has inspired so much speculation and analysis over the years. It is likely that Ellicott was privy to the secrets of the streets of Washington, D.C., as well as many other talismanic aspects and symbols of the new country. It appears that the diamond symbol of Chico and its street plan are related to the same tradition that Ellicott, Jefferson, Washington, and Madison had valued. Are there any indications that there is more to the similarity of the plans of Chico and Washington, D.C.? The answer to that question may astound and amaze any fan of alternate or hidden history. Annie Kennedy Bidwell was from Washington, D.C. originally. Annie is known by this name in many historical accounts of Chico since her maiden name was Kennedy. What many of these histories neglect to mention is that her full given name was Annie Ellicott Kennedy prior to her marriage to Chico founder John Bidwell. Annie Ellicott Bidwell was directly related via her father to the family of Andrew Ellicott, the man who had helped to plan and create the city of Washington, D.C. This factor alone may have contributed to why Chico was given the street plan and significance it had attained over the years. The diamond-shaped chessboard plan of Chico is very likely a result of Mrs. Bidwell's association with such an illustrious and storied family and their legacy in the creation of the premier array of talismanic architecture in the United States we see in Washington, D.C. It is only natural that Chico would be a reflection of this legacy. Chico is located on the latitude of the Mason-Dixon line, as are Denver and Indianapolis. All of these cities may be the product of the brain trust of the Society of the Cincinnati, of which the Ellicotts were also members. The legacy of where Chico was located may have been planned to lay on the latitude of the Mason-Dixon line, which Andrew Ellicott had also helped to document and survey. Ellicott had taken part in a resurvey and extension of the Mason-Dixon line, along with a younger James Madison in the late 1780s. In addition, it had been Andrew Ellicott who had trained Meriwether Lewis in surveying techniques as a personal favor to President Jefferson in preparation for the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. Chico had been designated a special place by a group of people who had created many cities and towns as part of their vision for the Republic of the United States of America. It held a special point on Earth that was representative of the ideals of the Republic via its geographic association with the International Peace Garden, the Mason-Dixon line, and the talismanic layout of our nation's capital. Now we may also consider the family associations of Annie Ellicott, Kennedy, Bidwell as a factor in these theories. These factors undoubtedly contributed to the reasons why so many first families of Hartford, Connecticut, and other storied families, such as the Bruces and Bacons, had come to Chico. From what we have seen so far, it may be surmised that Chico has always been considered a special place. All of this suggests the possibility that John Bidwell had actually selected the site for Chico based on his wife's family association with Andrew Ellicott, as well as its geographic relationship with the International Peace Garden and the latitude of the Mason-Dixon line. John and Annie Bidwell had created a little Washington, D.C., right here in Northern California.
This amazing association between Andrew Ellicott and Annie Bidwell may go a long way towards showing how the street plan of Chico was intentionally contrived in kind of a fashion of the day that was displayed in Washington, D.C., but also harkens back to the axe historique, or the historical axis of Paris, that was developed by the French royal family over time. And we also see this kind of style being expressed on estates of gentried people in Europe and England, also leading us to the Tower of the Winds at Shugborough Hall, the West Wickham Estate, and the Bude Storm Tower in Cornwall, that all have copies of the Tower of the Winds of Athens that also fit into this tradition, as do many of the linear aspects of these estates, and also the great cathedrals of Europe. We also see these kind of tenets being associated with Sir Francis Bacon and his inner circle, which also included Inigo Jones, one of the most famous landscape architects of the era, who also propagated this kind of fashion and kind of a feng shui of the day of the arrangement of monuments and municipal buildings in American cities later that also were arranged in this fashion. With this in mind, let's examine the Chico area to see if there are any other influences of Sir Francis Bacon and his tradition. In past works, such as my book, The Geographic Mysteries of Sir Francis Bacon, I speculated that other members of the Bacon family, extending from the Boston Brahmins and the first settlers of Hartford, Connecticut, and indeed Jamestown, Virginia as well, all over time kind of invested themselves in the establishment of places of talismanic importance, at which these styles of architecture and landscape architecture were used to communicate hidden meanings that related kind of to the Republican concept of the United States of America. In the past, these tenets had been used by royal and church interests to express their views about society, politics, and the moral framework of their lands were now being expressed in a truly American way, and Chico is no exception. So let's look to see if the influence of Sir Francis Bacon or some Bacon family members later in Butte County and Chico had an impact on why Chico has this interesting street plan.
In episode 1, we saw how John Bidwell had settled Chico and had a distant impact on the myths and legends of Mount Shasta via his family relations. John Bidwell had come to California in 1841 with one of the earliest wagon trains to come to the West. His friend and neighbor Peter Lassen came just about 1 year earlier in 1840 and worked in several places in California, plying his trade as a blacksmith before he obtained the Rancho Bosquejo land grant from then Mexican Governor Mythical. Lassen was a Danish citizen that, according to one source, had powerful and very wealthy Danish relatives. Lassen himself had come from Farum, Denmark, and had begun his journey west from Missouri in 1839, arriving in 1840. The history of Ranch Bosquejo, or Lassen's Ranch, includes a legacy that connects both Mount Shasta and the development of Northern California and its myths and legends. Eventually, Lassen sold his ranch and invested his money in a steamship that he believed could travel the upper Sacramento River. This scheme came to an unfortunate end when his boat sunk on its first trip up the river. Lassen's property would eventually become the property of Leland Stanford, who coincidentally had also obtained the former Ayrshire farm of Paulin Caperon, where the Frenchman's Tower is located. After a time, this land became the domain of Stanford University and was eventually given to the monastery of New Clairvaux. While Lassen still owned his ranch, he made a trip to Missouri with Commodore Stockton and returned with the very first Masonic charter to come to California. At this time, he planned a city named Benton City after Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who may have assisted the Californians in obtaining this charter. In his honor, Lassen named the town he planned on his ranch Benton City. This made Benton City home to the first Masonic lodge in California. Another source states that Lassen had wealthy relatives in St. Louis, Missouri, thus echoing the other claim that he was related to wealthy Danish interests. Though there are sources that state this, there are also those that question these connections. Eventually, after Lassen's plan for a town failed, this charter was moved to the Masonic Lodge at Mount Shasta City, where it still resides today. Interestingly, a man named Lucian Stewart was one of the first signers of this document, which is interesting given his distant relations to those who owned and ran the Hudson's Bay Company. Indeed, the era during which Lassen first came to California included him landing first at the Russian colony at Bodega Bay during the era the Hudson's Bay Company was still active in California. Some even credit the Hudson's Bay Company with founding San Francisco, which was then known as Yerba Buena, or good herb in English. This is all very interesting when considering the family relation between the Russian and English royal families during subsequent eras. Another common thread would also include the fact that California was first claimed by Sir Francis Drake during his voyage of discovery and named New Albion. During Lassen's tenure at his ranch near Chico, he also hosted Captain John C. Fremont and his soldiers, who used it as a kind of base of operations for a period of time. Interestingly, poet of the Sierras Joaquin Miller was also a friend of Fremont's. One of the towers on Miller's Heights estate due south of the peak of Mount Shasta includes the Fremont Tower, as Miller believed his property was the first place that Fremont had viewed the Golden Gate from. A town just south of Oakland is named for Fremont. This connection is interesting because of the presence of similar carvings to those seen where Miller lived and met Fremont at Castle Crags near Mount Shasta, and other very similar rock art on Miller's estate in Oakland.
The inclusion of Joaquin Miller in practicing this tradition of talismanic architecture in association with Mount Shasta is also interesting considering the connections to Washington, D.C. we see in Chico. Prior to establishing his Heights estate in Oakland, which is due south of the peak of Mount Shasta, Joaquin Miller lived on the White House Meridian in Washington, D.C. for a period of 2 years in Joaquin Miller Cabin, which has now been moved to Rock Creek Park. So it appears that Joaquin Miller had a value of the placement of where he lived and these monuments in association with a kind of personal prime meridian. We also see President Jefferson having been associated with, quote, personal meridians, and in past works we've examined the geographic properties of his estate, Poplar Forest and Monticello, as well as the rotunda at the University of Virginia, all built in the Palladian style. And as we've seen before, we even see that the octagon of Poplar Forest points the way to Mount Shasta.
A common thread in many of the stories of people like Peter Lassen includes the existence of a lost treasure, and Lassen's ranch is no exception. After speculation that Lassen had not spent all of the riches he had from selling his ranch, a rumor developed that he had stashed a treasure of gold and silver coins in iron pots somewhere on his property. It seems Lassen was part of a group of people who had come to California not only to seek their fortune, but to possibly look out for the interests of some of his more well-heeled relatives and associates. Lassen's life and legacy connect him to many of the other figures of mystery and intrigue in this story. Eventually, Peter Lassen would settle near what is today Susanville, California, where he is interred on the property he once owned, beneath a very impressive granite obelisk that also tells of how he was killed by Indians near what is called the Black Rock Desert of Nevada today. In fact, the end of Lassen's life would supply one final mystery in the life of an amazing man. There had been rumors of a silver strike not far from Susanville in Nevada. Strangely, this silver strike was said to be comprised of free silver, or silver nuggets, which is nearly unheard of and rarely exists anywhere. In response to these rumors, Lassen rode off with his friends to attempt to find this rumored silver deposit. Unfortunately, this would lead to the death of this man under mysterious circumstances. Though it was reported that he was killed by Indians, today this is generally discounted, and it is assumed that no one really knows who killed Peter Lassen, as he was killed by a sniper that was not seen by anyone that was with him. Peter Lassen had died a great California pioneer and is remembered as such, just as John Bidwell is. His legacy of bringing the first Masonic charter to California is important to local history and its development, but does it have anything to do with the New Age myths and legends of Mount Shasta? Though many conspiracy theories may ascribe these activities to the Masons, it is clear via a close look that this simply is not true. In the end, the presence of such an historical document at Mount Shasta is an interesting footnote to a rural region that has a wealth of stories and folklore that may be related to an entirely different cast of movers and shakers. In earlier episodes, we explored the legacy of John Bidwell and how he was descendant of the Bidulphs of Staffordshire and Ormus Legidon, the Knights Templar standard-bearer from the 11th century. Given this a closer examination of other people who helped to settle Chico and Northern California in association with Bidwell and Lassen may reveal a mystery that goes all the way back to Elizabethan England and beyond, including a value of William Shakespeare and all the questions surrounding his great works. All of this will be laid bare in an examination of the mystery that had been arranged in Gold Rush-era California in this tradition. The streets of Chico do indeed tell a strange tale. A great deal of evidence suggests that a cadre of individuals who had similar views about aristocracy, the Catholic Church, and their ancient heritage had created much of the air of mystery and intrigue surrounding the Bard. While many attribute the works of Shakespeare to Sir Francis Bacon, or the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, it may be that a larger group which included both men had cooperated to produce these famous works. Others, such as the Wilton Writers' Circle of Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, may have also played a hand in producing the works of Shakespeare, which are credited with homogenizing the English language and culture while also providing good entertainment for the English people. Within this group was a family core, all related to the de Vere family and their long and illustrious history that even includes a said relation to the biblical character of Noah himself. Note here that William Shakespeare also held family ties to this group of people and others who had used art and literature to hide and communicate specific themes and concepts. Interestingly, the de Vere and Bacon families have similar arms or family crests, including hogs or pigs and the five-pointed star. Even the flyleaf of Mary Sidney's book about geomancy includes the symbol of a hog. The famous First Folio of Shakespeare was both financed and dedicated to the sons of Mary Sidney, Herbert, who both married the daughters of the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. In his work, Eureka, even Edgar Allan Poe refers to Bacon as the hog. A close look at many mysteries of North America reveals that some of these conundrums may have been designed using the works of Shakespeare to suggest answers or clues to places like Oak Island, the Newport Tower, Bacon's Vault of Williamsburg, the Kensington Rune, and more. It also seems that descendants, or those that believe they were descendants of these families, had in large part arranged all of these historical questions and mysteries. Is it possible that somehow the works of Shakespeare and this family group were involved in the mysteries and legends of Northern California, if not Mount Shasta itself? We have seen how the Chico City Plaza points to Benton City or the modern location of the monastery of New Clairvaux. This alignment also contains other possible points of interest that may shed a great deal of light on how and why the de Vere family and the legends of Sir Francis Bacon and Shakespeare may have been part of how and why Benton City was such a special place in the minds of early settlers of the Chico area. As this azimuth on the globe extending from the Chico City Plaza transects to the northeast, it crosses a small cemetery on Broyles Road a few miles south of the monastery of New Clairvaux. One of the individuals interred in the Pine Creek Cemetery is named Thomas Lafayette Bacon. It seems that Thomas Bacon had been named for two Society of the Cincinnati members Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette. Thomas had originally come from Denver, Colorado to this sparsely populated area between Chico and Benton City, or Vina as it is known today. In fact, Denver, Colorado had also been founded by a man named Bacon, who in turn was related to the wife of the famous General Custer. Amazingly, Chico and Denver even lay along the same line of latitude on the globe that coincidentally also marks the famous Mason-Dixon line. Is it possible that Thomas Lafayette Bacon had made his way to this region as part of his family legacy, also echoing the development of Denver? Had these mysteries included specific points on the earth that had been obtained or managed by this family trust? The answer to that question is difficult to surmise, but may include a resounding yes once all the evidence is examined. As it turns out, this rural area was home to other members of the Bacon, De Vere, Montgomery, Campbell, and Bruce families of Scotland, in addition to the founders of Hartford, Connecticut, that had come to Chico. The Hartford Founders Monument does also include the name Bacon. It does indeed appear that a mystery in the tradition of Sir Francis Bacon had been planned by original family members that includes the first Masonic charter to come to California, the Monastery of New Clairvaux, the Chico City Plaza, the Palace of the Legion of Honor of Paris and San Francisco, the International Peace Garden, the Frenchman's Tower of Palo Alto, the Heights Estate of Joaquin Miller, the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose, and finally, Mount Shasta itself. Their involvement in Northern California may indicate their involvement in other similar mysteries that appear throughout U.S. and Canadian history. This mystery will also expose the existence of a copy of the Palace of the Legion of Honor of Paris, having been built on the former property of Peter Lassen in what is today Rennes, California, now home to the Monastery of New Clairvaux. The entryway to this structure includes a rendering of the arms of a branch of the De Vere family. In addition, this reproduction of the Palace of the Legion of Honor was constructed as the Rennes Elementary School in 1924, only a few years after the ground was broken for the Palace of the Legion of Honor replica in San Francisco, built by Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels. The Marquis de Lafayette was a member of the Legion of Honor of France, as well as also suggesting a connection in all these clues. As stated prior, the Rennes Elementary School seems to have a very similar plan view of the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. Using this structure in Rennes as a pointing device on the globe yields some very surprising results that may serve to support the notion of mystery and intrigue on the part of Lassen. If an arc on the globe is plotted corresponding to the position and orientation of the Rennes Elementary School, an azimuth on the globe is created that transects or points directly to the grave of Peter Lassen near Susanville, California, to the east. This association would seemingly have been an intentional arrangement by others that were privy to the entire mystery during the era when the Palace of the Legion of Honor of San Francisco had just been built a short time prior. A building on the former ranch of Lassen, where the first Masonic charter to come to California, that now includes the Cistercian Monastery of New Clairvaux, actually leads one to his grave. What we are seeing here may be part of another man-in-the-mountain mystery, such as what we see at Mount Shasta and other places. The fact that legends exist of a treasure left by Lassen at Rennes and him searching for a treasure of sorts when he died may all figure into the story as well. Note here that the Monastery of New Clairvaux was not given the property they now occupy until it was made a gift from Stanford University in 1974. Stanford University had in turn inherited the property from Leland Stanford, who had used it as a vineyard for quite some time before that. Later, William Randolph Hearst brought the sacred stones of the monastery of Santa Maria de Avila from Spain to California, where they would eventually be rebuilt into the chapter house we see at New Clairvaux today. Is it possible that even the monastery is a symbolic nod to the Baconian legacy we see in Butte County, Tehama County, Lassen County, Mount Shasta, and Chico? The fact that Lassen had brought the first Masonic charter to Benton City or Vina may be the reason why the elementary school and later the monastery were built. Interestingly, as stated prior, this Masonic charter would eventually end up at Western Star Lodge number 98 in Mount Shasta City in the shadow of Mount Shasta itself. It seems that the charter, whether by chance or design, has left many unanswered questions and mysteries in its wake associated with Baconian ideals, lost treasure, and the legacy of many Norman families of France, England, Scotland, Italy, and Sicily. It is clear that the Plantagenets and Merovingians of this era had also displayed a tradition in planning and executing these mysterious examples of art and architecture that tell many strange stories. In addition to the presence of Thomas Lafayette Bacon in the vicinity of Vina and the future monastery of New Clairvaux, we also see George K. Bacon being a prominent citizen of Butte County, as recorded in the book The History of Butte County. Amazingly, Mr. Bacon's brother's name was Hardy DeVere Bacon, and George even named his son Baxter DeVere Bacon. At the very least, it appears that George Bacon had a belief that he was somehow family to the original Bacon family of Sir Francis Bacon, as well as the DeVere family legacy. These connections may be solidified with the inclusion of the hog or pig on both the DeVere and Bacon family crests. Is it possible that George and Thomas Bacon were aware of or had helped to create this entire scheme? Both Thomas Lafayette Bacon and George K. Bacon and family lived in the small hamlet of Cana, situated a few miles south of Vina and its elementary school that is festooned with the images suggesting the family arms of DeVere, complete with dragons, fleur-de-lis, and the Merovingian bee symbol. Amazingly, these symbols also have some connections to the famous Priory of Sion that may be part of the mysteries of Rennes le Chateau in France, also made popular in the movie The Da Vinci Code. Had the legend that states the Merovingian dynasty were the sorcerer kings or kings of mystery been the impetus for how these strange structures had been built in the Chico area? The use of the name Cana is a reference to the wedding at Cana in the Bible, in which Jesus turns water into wine. Many speculate that it was Jesus who had married Mary Magdalene on that day. Indeed, the Auspice of Maria symbol is hidden within the diamond logo valued in Chico for many years. This symbol is visible on the Senator Theater Tower in Chico, as well as the old Bank of America building, the Chico State Administration building entrance, and the Gateway Science Museum, also a part of Chico State. Interestingly, a later General Montgomery of Scots descent was one of the founders of what was originally called the Chico Normal School for teachers. This same entryway to the administration building of Chico State includes a rendering of Romulus and Remus suckling from the she-wolf that also includes a Templar cross enclosed in a circle. Unfortunately, General Montgomery is also known for helping to annihilate the native population of Northern California.
It was terribly interesting that George K. Bacon named his son Hardy de Vere Bacon. This links the name of the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, and Sir Francis Bacon, both of which are prime suspects to have actually created the works of Shakespeare. It's possible that these two men worked with others to create the works of Shakespeare in tandem with William Shakespeare himself. This link between the Bacon and de Vere names in Chico may relate to the fact that the 1938 classic film, The Adventures of Robin Hood, was filmed in the Chico area, including Bidwell Park, and included scenes that featured the famous Hooker Oak of Chico. This is an interesting further connection to the de Vere family, as members of their family were indeed considered the historical Robin Hood in England. Now, this de Vere connection is interesting in that Robert de Vere was the historical claimant to the earldom of Cambridge and Huntingdon, the inheritor of the lands of Fitzooth or Hood. Robert, or Robin, was a Knights Templar in accordance with this legend. He was outlawed by King John and lost all his lands and castles. Robert was indeed the historical Robin Hood, Robin Goodfellow, or Puck, also mentioned by many commentators as being the character Puck in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which of course many also postulate that Edward de Vere, the 16th, 17th Earl of Oxford, had actually penned. So this is an interesting connection again to Chico history and the classic film The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Errol Flynn, who did indeed come to Chico and was said to live in the area for a few years while the film was being produced. So the legend of Robin Hood could be intertwined with the, quote, mysteries of Chico in these connections with the Bacon family. So this interesting tale is telling us of a legacy of literary figures and works that may have been valued by descendants of the same families of Sir Francis Bacon, the de Vere family, and we even have John Bidwell, and the Bidwell family being associated with the famous work Beowulf. It seems like a cast of characters, including many early pioneers of California, had contributed to this overall mystery, that it does include a landscape and architectural element. Chico, over the years, has acquired many buildings that have interesting motifs, including the ones discussed, the Bank of America building, the Senator Theater, and others, including Bidwell Mansion, may have elements of them that are meant to tell this tale, and part of this may be where they are, in addition to the way they're decorated and valued. So we have Peter Lassen, John Bidwell, the de Vere family, the Bacon family, and others having settled in this region around the time John Bidwell settled Chico and the gold rush of California was going on. It's interesting to note that this region north of Chico yielded very little gold, and these men were all interested in agricultural pursuits. So the legacy of the property where the monastery of New Clairvaux is now located is really part of the key to understanding all of this. First of all, it was a Mexican rancho. Peter Lassen obtained it. And then in the future, Leland Stanford owned it, and then Stanford University, who donated it to the monks of New Clairvaux. And we see the Masonic charter coming there, which may have some value for Freemasons, that is now at the Mount Shasta Lodge. And we see Mount Shasta having some of this mythology there, too. All of this investigation does not indicate that Freemasons are involved in propagating the myths and legends of Mount Shasta, but other groups have valued this, possibly starting at the time of the Frenchman's Tower. If Henry V Artois had something to do with the Frenchman's Tower, or a person in a similar situation to his that had these kind of Plantagenet or Merovingian values, then the Frenchman's Tower is kind of initiating one into a kind of man-in-the-mountain mythology that involves Mount Shasta that Joaquin Miller later became aware of, and quite possibly this band of descendants of famous literary figures in the Chico area, including possibly descendants of Sir Francis Bacon, the De Vere family, the Bruce family, and many others that have contributed to establishing towns and cities in Northern California and possibly other places in California as well. So really what we kind of see is them kind of replicating this talismanic landscape using follies and pieces of architecture that are meant to send a message and provide one with clues that may be followed that really kind of tell the truth about associated folklore. And really a lot of what I'm saying disappoints many conspiracy theorists or people who have New Age beliefs, but my intention is not to do that, but to really just kind of tell this interesting historical story and let everyone decide for themselves. Hello, I'm Cort Lindahl. Welcome to Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Episode 3. In our series about Mount Shasta, we've been discussing a lot of the historical overtones of the myths and legends of Mount Shasta. Now, this is not to say that there is no city within the mountain or any of the other attributes that a lot of the beliefs that people have may indicate. We're here just to inform everybody of the historical overtones of what is going on there and why it may have been considered a special place. This may be the reasons why the things that you believe happen at Mount Shasta. Though I somewhat question the existence of a city in Mount Shasta, I've never been inside Mount Shasta to see if there is indeed anything there. So, where do the myths and legends of Mount Shasta really come from? Most of the modern myths and legends of Mount Shasta come from a book called A Dweller on Two Planets by Frederick Spencer Oliver. Though this book was first published in 1906, it was said to have been written in 1886. A Dweller on Two Planets reveals many concepts that we see today at Mount Shasta, including the city of Telos, the beings that live there, flying ships in the air, and Bigfoot. Surprisingly, most of the information in A Dweller on Two Planets had already been written and spoken of in France in 1885 by a man named Alexander Saint-Yves. Saint-Yves wrote another book based on the subterranean city of Agartha in the Himalayas that contains all of the same characteristics and highlights that Oliver included in A Dweller on Two Planets. Saint-Yves' book, The Mission de Indi en Europa, also exposes a city beneath the mountain, the beings that live there, flying airships, and the Yeti or Bigfoot-like creature. So it's very interesting that both of these books came to be during the same year. In 1886, both of these volumes were said to have been published, and this is somewhat suspicious, leading to the possibility that there were French influences in the developments of the modern myths and legends of Mount Shasta. We also see French influences in the Society of the Cincinnati, at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, at the Frenchman's Tower we already discussed, and possibly we see Joaquin Miller, the poet of the Sierras, being aware of this entire scheme and expressing himself with his pyramid in Oakland due south of the peak of Mount Shasta. Joaquin Miller would also go on to have a commune on his property in Oakland before the turn of the 20th century, and was known to be a student of Buddhism, further linking us into Eastern concepts in an appreciation of Mount Shasta by the poet of the Sierras, and really somebody that may have had a peripheral influence on the later Beat Generation and hippie movements in the Bay Area of San Francisco. Also not to be overlooked is the use of or actual belief in these myths and legends on the part of the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler. They indeed did search the Far East for relics and concepts, as we see at the beginning of even the movie Indiana Jones, which takes place in Tibet and involves Nazi agents trying to find out what is going on. So that's not too far from the truth. This in turn again leads us to the Enochian concepts of UFOs, cities beneath the mountain, and all of this as later expressed by foreign or French interests in the era just before World War I and II. Is it possible that these concepts were introduced as an intelligence ploy to influence people, or is there more truth to the story? Here also in this same period we see Nicholas Roerich using these same concepts to possibly influence Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his vice president. We know Franklin was also interested in the Oak Island treasure mystery and was related to the same Lawrence family that the family of George Washington was related to. So the fact that Roerich was from Imperial Russia and had a great interest in these kinds of concepts may link him to the later exploits of Madame Blavatsky, or that he was in fact propagating or keeping alive her ideas of these myths and legends of the Far East. Whether this connects to Mount Shasta or not is another question, but it is clear a similar philosophy and group was at work in Europe and Mount Shasta. This connection between Alexander St. Eve and Mount Shasta and its mythology is amazing when one considers that Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society adapted many of St. Eve's ideas about the East, subterranean cities, and the other common aspects we see to the mythology of Mount Shasta as applied by the faith-based groups there today that hold these beliefs. So here's yet another amazing connection that will link us from St. Eve's to A Dweller on Two Planets of Frederick Spencer Oliver, and some sort of theosophical connection in which these concepts were meant to be promoted at Mount Shasta as well as other parts of the world. Really, what we're seeing here with the involvement of Alexandre Saint-Yves is how later the Nazi regime became familiar with all of these concepts from the occult societies in Europe that had adapted these ideas a little earlier. So later, we see the Nazis even adapting the swastika and a lot of their philosophy about the Aryan race from what they perceived to be Tibetan folklore. Is it possible that the Nazis were being used just as later we see the Native American mythology and lore being used? It is clear via this chain of evidence that Madame Blavatsky was influenced by Saint-Yves, and in turn Nicholas Roerich was influenced by Madame Blavatsky. Is it possible that these two were kind of agents of Imperial Russia that later had influence on the United States government? We see them using the same concepts put forth by Saint-Yves and others, including the Nazis, referring to Agartha as Asgard of the Viking culture. So they were again relating Eastern concept from another culture and interpreting them in a kind of Viking or Nordic framework that kind of fit their vision of the world better. So there's lots of variables here, and it is just very interesting that the Nazis gained all of their value possibly of UFOs. A lot of the things we see about Nazis and UFOs really may have their roots in the Book of Enoch and this Himalayan mythology that was promoted by French factions. Now, given all of this, it's terribly interesting that J.D. Hooker, whom the Hooker Oak in Chico is named for, had been to the Himalayas in the 1840s, long before any of these books were written. On his trip to Chico, in which the Hooker Oak was named for him, he made a trip to Mount Shasta with John Muir and Asa Gray of the Linnaean Society of London. One source has him discussing stories of the Himalayas around the campfire on this trip to Mount Shasta. Now, this is even more amazing when you consider that the works of Saint-Yves and Frederick Spencer Oliver were both comprised of channeled material. Neither men had actually been to the Himalayas. Now, both of them had heard of this somewhere. How is it that both of these books and concepts manifested themselves in the same year of 1886 on different sides of the world? Is it possible that all of these things had been arranged by a certain group or secret society? Now, some of these early explorers and historians of California would have included Russian citizens who occupied the colony in the North Bay area during the 1840s in California. There are theories that this Russian colony was responsible for the name of Mount Shasta. So there is an early Russian connection, and indeed a Russian imperial connection to the myths and legends of California. This is right at about the time that J.D. Hooker was actually visiting the Himalayan region in his travels in the Far East. So here we have a distinct Russian connection, with even some crediting the Russians with having named Mount Shasta. Also note the similarity in the motif of the California flag, including the bear and the red star. These are also two primary symbols of Russia. Is it possible that early explorers and settlers in the Mount Shasta area viewed the Native American mythology in their own terms? Did they see hints of the lapis exilis, the Nephilim, in the form of Bigfoot or other legends that the Native Americans had? Here in the creation myth of Shasta Springs, we'll see several references that kind of fit this Enochian overlay of appreciation of what's going on at Mount Shasta.
The Great Spirit and his family dwelt within, and the smoke curling up from the summit showed that the fire was burning on the hearth. Then a great storm came, and the wind blew the ocean against the mountain and made it tremble. The Great Spirit asked his little daughter to go up and quiet the storm, cautioning her not to look out, but to put forth her hand and make a sign before giving the command. The child clambered up the roof, did as told, and was about to descend, when her curiosity got the best of her. She wanted to see what the world looked like. She put out her head. The wind caught her by the hair, dragged her down the mountainside, and left her in the land of the grizzly bears. Near the mountain base dwelt a family of grizzlies. The old grizzly was returning home from a hunt with a young elk in one paw and a bludgeon on his shoulder. He spied the fair child unconscious on the ground. He lifted the little one tenderly and carried her to his home. The old mother grizzly pitied the child and gave her milk from her own breast and reared her as one of her own family. The girl grew up and married the eldest son of the old grizzly, and their offspring was a man. The grizzlies then were very different from the grizzlies now. They walked erect like men, carried clubs for weapons, and talked. When man was born, the grizzly nation rejoiced and was filled with pride. They united and built a wigwam for the young mother near the Great Spirit, and it is known now as Little Mount Shasta, or today, Black Butte. Many years passed away. The old mother grizzly became feeble and felt she was soon to die. Her conscience smote her because through all the years she had concealed from the Great Spirit the whereabouts of his child. She called the grizzlies together at the new lodge and sent her eldest grandson up toward the clouds to the summit of Mount Shasta to tell the Great Spirit where his darling might be found. When the Great Spirit heard, he was filled with joy and ran down the mountain with great speed. So great was his speed, the snow was melted and streams began to flow, and hidden watercourses were formed. And the fountain and springs along the Sacramento, including the wonderful Shasta Spring, began to flow as they continue to this day. The Grizzly Nation had assembled from all quarters of their domain and prepared a grand reception. As the Great Spirit neared his daughter's wigwam, he found thousands of grizzlies standing erect with clubs on their shoulders, in two files facing, one on either side of the door. As the Great Spirit sped down between the lines, shouts of welcome rent the air. He reached his child, but when he found her so changed, and that a new race had been created without his consent, he was seized with anger. His rage was fearful to behold. He looked at the old grandmother grizzly with such an awful countenance that she died on the spot. Then the grizzlies began to howl and lament. The Great Spirit lifted his daughter tenderly in his arms, and before departing, turned to the grizzlies and cursed them in his fury. "Be silent," he cried. "Never again speak. Stand erect no more. Use your hands as feet and look to the ground till I come again." And also drove the new race of men from him. He then closed the door of Little Mount Shasta and returned to his own wigwam, carrying his daughter with him. and they were never afterward seen. The grizzlies are still under his curse. They never speak or stand erect except when life is in danger, when the Great Spirit permits them to stand upright as of old and use their fists like men. The Great Spirit with his daughter long since returned to the island and beyond the sky. The wigwam is abandoned. The hearthstone is cold. Smoke no longer curls upwards from the summit of Mount Shasta.
So, does this Native American myth refer to what we might call Bigfoot in the 21st century? It may be that during the 19th century, this story may have been interpreted as meaning the Nephilim from the Book of Enoch and other biblical sources. While many people would like to believe that Europeans affected the spiritual mores of Native Americans, it's clear that they had a mythology and faith that included many of the same concepts that Europeans held in secret. So the way that Europeans reacted to this is interesting in the way they appreciated the myths and legends. What we're seeing here is the fact that the Native American legends of Mount Shasta may have made them think that European people had been there before and taught this to the Native Americans. This is a repeated theme in many contact era happenings between Europeans and Native Americans. So while it is possible that Europeans had contacted them in the past, it's equally as possible that Native American people had developed this mythology on their own as part of being a human being on the face of the earth. We all may have things in common that lead us to similar ends. This is true that the Native Americans had their own extensive mythology. It's also clear that there were European interests that would wish to manipulate their lore. In the process of this, it is possible that some of this was altered to match the European point of view. So all sides must be considered in this great mystery. In addition to the similarities we see between Enochian thought and the Native American legends of Mount Shasta, we also see a distinct similarity between the legends, mythology, and religious mores of the Himalayan region of the far east of Nepal and India. In fact, in episode 1 we discussed how botanist J.D. Hooker made a trip with John Bidwell of Chico and Asa Gray of the Linnean Society of London to Castle Crags and Mount Shasta. One narration of this trip has J.D. Hooker assailing the other participants on this trip with stories of his adventures in the Himalayas from 20 years earlier. J.D. Hooker's trip involves him going to some of the locations that are actually thought of to be Shambhala and Shangri-La, and even the region where the entrance to Agartha is, the subterranean city that is referred to in Himalayan mythology. So we do see their mythology also having a great deal to do with distinct identifiable mountains and myths of cities beneath the mountain and Bigfoot-like creatures in the form of the Yeti. So it's an interesting crossroads here at Mount Shasta between many different views of faith as interpreted in the 20th century in the Republic of the United States of America, where everybody has the freedom to choose what their faith is and what they believe or not. To see how these concepts may have manifested themselves in later California and Western history, let's look at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and the Maryhill Museum of Art and Stonehenge replica in Washington State that all show the hand of descendants of George Washington and the first families of colonial America in their construction. We also see the Society of the Cincinnati influence and some of the occult and Gnostic overtones that we see in the Rennes le Chateau mystery and other places.
The stories of the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and the Maryhill Museum of Art and Stonehenge replica in Washington State exposes many strange and unknown facets of early America and California. Both structures are associated with the same family group related to George Washington that created the Kensington Rune mystery, the International Peace Garden, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Virginia Company, the Beale Treasure Legend, Oak Island Treasure Legend, the Powder Magazine in colonial Williamsburg, St. Paul's Chapel of New York City, and the Newport Tower. Both the Palace of the Legion of Honor and the Maryhill Museum of Art may also contain interpretive art that may reveal many things about the mysteries that fascinate us. For many, it may be hard to believe that a family group that was motivated by both the concept of the Republic and the Jacobite cause in England and Scotland had created these conundrums, possibly to clue one into the true nature of the mysteries at hand. In past works, we have discussed how the concept of a New Jerusalem was transplanted to North America and may be interpreted from an English, French, Scottish, and American perspective. Many times, a New Jerusalem would include an array of octagonal structure aligned with a chapel, as we see on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In addition, the New Jerusalem concept seems to have been included in many mysteries and lost treasure myths, the most famous of which includes the Ark of the Covenant and other lost relics from the Temple Mount itself. These legends in turn lead us to the Rosicrucian mythology of the Man in the Mountain, as applied by Charlemagne, and the mythology of Mount Shasta and other places. The legacy of the Hill family, who were originally a first family of Virginia, includes the family traditions and values of the Washington family, as well as many other premier families of early Virginia and other colonies. Part of the strategy of many gentled groups of colonists was to have a valued representative at each new colony, as well as others in the West Indies, England, and Scotland. In this manner, many family ties became important beyond their value as family members, and these groups may comprise some of the more storied industries and institutions of the early and modern United States. The Hills were very successful in commerce and banking, and included the Great Northern Railroad among their accomplishments. Included in the Hill family was James Hill, the creator of the Great Northern, and Samuel Hill, who was an engineer and civic planner of note in Washington State. His role in the development of Washington's road system is interesting, given his descent from Lawrence Washington, the half-brother of George Washington. Mr. Hill was enormously successful and was also a collector of fine art and literature. Eventually, Mr. Hill would build the Maryhill Museum of Art in Maryhill, Washington.
The Maryhill Museum of Art is a fascinating place for many different reasons that go beyond its association with Samuel Hill, the Great Northern Railroad, and his ancestry that includes George Washington. When Samuel Hill opened the Maryhill Museum of Art in the early 1920s, Queen Marie of Romania attended the opening ceremonies. Queen Marie is an interesting and well-respected character who had a fantastic lineage that linked her to possibly Saint Germain and Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the first governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. And we have seen the Hudson's Bay Company involved in many of the mysteries, from the Kensington Rune stone to now the Maryhill Museum of Art and the mysteries of Mount Shasta. So Queen Marie was the eldest daughter of Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the former Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, respectively, the son of Queen Victoria and daughter of Emperor Alexander II. So she came from a very impressive line. This is very reminiscent of Prince Edward in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the influence he may have had on the Oak Island treasure. So it's very interesting that Queen Marie's legacy is intertwined with that of the Washington family and all of their associated families, including the Hill Railroad Empire. So it's interesting to speculate whether the involvement of Queen Marie, being really Russian royalty and possibly some of the only Russian royal blood remaining, is an interesting story in association with how the Russian monarchy came to an end during the communist revolution in Russia. So it's again interesting that we have the kind of images of Helena Blavatsky and Nicholas Roerich, with a former Russian colony having once existed in California, and now the involvement of Queen Marie in the Maryhill Museum of Art, where she donated many items of royal regalia and of Orthodox religious art, and indeed she also donated quite a bit of art and items to the Palace of the Legion and Honor Museum, and was associated with Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels, who is also instrumental in keeping the Maryhill Museum of Art going after the death of Samuel Hill. So she managed that for many years later. She was a tireless patron of the arts, and we see the results of her labors at both of these fine museums.
Adjacent to the museum, Mr. Hill constructed a replica of Stonehenge in the form of a World War I memorial. This representative display of a temple or temporally sensitive structure fit the entire pattern of value of the octagonal powder magazine in colonial Williamsburg that the Hills were undoubtedly familiar with. Spatial qualities of the Maryhill Stonehenge seem to point to another example of Mr. Hill's fascination with monuments that is located on the border of the United States and Canada. Using an octagonal division, Mr. Hill's Stonehenge points to or forms an arc on the globe that leads to the Peace Arch in Douglas, Canada, also constructed by Hill. The theme of the Peace Arch echoes the theme of the International Peace Garden, also on the border further east in Manitoba and North Dakota. The Peace Garden is an amazing New Jerusalem that appears as a linear park similar to the National Mall or the alignment of Place de la Concorde at Tuileries Garden of Paris, near the Louvre Museum. The Peace Garden includes an octagonal structure aligned with a chapel, thus suggesting its role as a New Jerusalem. The International Peace Garden is a veneration of the Temple of Peace of Rome, built by Vespasian in the 1st century. Amazingly, the linear orientation of the Temple of Peace of Rome, along with the fora of Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan, forms an arc on the globe that points to the International Peace Garden. Part of the landscaping of the International Peace Garden also resembles the planned view of the Temple of Peace in Rome. In turn, the octagon of the International Peace Garden points the way to Chico, which in part explains what we learned in the first 2 episodes about that town in California.
The Temple of Peace of Rome is an important place in that the temple treasure was once displayed there. The temple treasure was taken from the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD by Titus and brought back to Rome, where it was displayed in the Temple of Peace. After the Visigoths invaded Rome, the fate of the treasure was never known of again. A great deal of mythology and lore has sprung up around the temple treasure and other biblical relics that may have been displayed at the Temple of Peace. In this way, it is interesting that the Temple of the Peace of Rome is venerated at the International Peace Garden on the border of the United States and Canada. Note here how the planned view of the Temple of Peace of Rome resembles the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and Paris. Let's have a look at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in Paris and how it relates to the 3/4 size reproduction in San Francisco built by Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels. The Palace of the Legion of Honor in Paris is adjacent to the Axe Historique, or the historical axis of Paris, that's comprised of the Place de la Concorde, the Tuileries Garden, and the rest of the alignment that reaches out to the Arc de Triomphe and beyond to Le Grand Arch, which was added recently. Here we see the octagonal form of the octagonal basin that's part of the Tuileries Garden, first built during the time of Louis XV, creating an arc on the globe that extends to San Francisco and the Palace of the Legion of Honor there. This is only a short distance, the octagonal fountain in Paris, from the Palace of the Legion of Honor there, that also has an octagonal motif in the rotunda. So a measurement taken from that building would not differ from this. The Palace of the Legion of Honor of Paris actually points to the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. This is likely an intentional arrangement. And here we see how the Palace of the Legion of Honor is oriented to point to the octagon at the International Peace Garden on the border of the United States and Canada. Indeed, all of this activity and all of these structures are linked together through a common philosophy and family that built such structures in part to possibly clue us all in to the true nature of this history. Then back at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, we also see this alignment leading to the Peace Garden, which matches the orientation of the building, including a kind of talismanic array of sculpture and artwork as well. Here we even see the large sculpture just to the east of the fountain in front of the Palace of Legion of Honor in San Francisco, being named Pax Jerusalem, thus echoing the theme of the International Peace Garden as a new Jerusalem. In this way, this sculpture is giving us a further clue as to this association. In this alignment of artwork, we also see a small glass pyramid of which a copy is present at the United Nations in New York. San Francisco was the birthplace of the United Nations, and the Palace of the Legion of Honor was indeed used as offices for the United Nations at that time. The rest of this alignment includes a statue of Joan of Arc and Rodin's sculpture of the Thinker that was brought to the United States by Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels. For her efforts in building the Palace of the Legion of Honor, Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels was made a member of the Legion of Honor of France. So what we're seeing here is a series of architecture that it appears were arranged to actually point to each other on the globe while still telling the story of the American and French revolutions with regard to the values of the Society of the Cincinnati of both France and the United States. Building a similar building in the Legion of Honor in both places is a kind of talismanic symbol that clues us into this value. So with this in mind, it's curious that earlier the Frenchman's Tower had been built in Palo Alto, and we kind of see this spiritual war kind of going on between the interests that built the Frenchman's Tower and people like Joaquin Miller and others that were likely associated with the Society of the Cincinnati. The Society of the Cincinnati likely saw value in being aware of the values of the royal class in the way they attempted to infiltrate Gold Rush era California. This was a time of exiled kings in France, so huge interest associated with that monarchy may have invested their money in Palo Alto and the stock farm known as the Ayrshire Farm there that would become Stanford University. So all of this does lead us to Chico, elements of the Rosicrucian order in San Jose, Guy Ballard, Henry Steele Olcott, and the rest of the people at Mount Shasta that had a hand in forming the myths and legends of the mountain there that have kind of turned into some mainstream religious beliefs over time as well. So we're not here to shed light or criticize people for their beliefs, just to add some historical context to what's going on and how it relates to older mysteries such as Rennes le Chateau and others in Europe. Thanks for joining me here on this episode 3 of the Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Mount Shasta Revealed, and stay tuned for one more episode coming up soon. If you're interested in what you've seen in the last 3 episodes of Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, please see my book, Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Mount Shasta Revealed by Bradbury Cort Lindahl. It's available at CreateSpace and Amazon.com, as well as the Cort Lindahl author page on Facebook. Thank you very much.
No tale from beyond the frontier of mysterious Tibet, or from the depths of dark Africa, is more weird than tonight's unsolved mystery, laid in California. A mystery which, for downright eeriness, rivals the imaginative writings of an Arthur Conan Doyle. I wasn't just talking.
Well, I'll tell you where to go, but you must make me a promise.
Yes? I'll promise.
When I've told you, you must go. And you must go with no idea of personal profit or gain. No idea of using what you may find for picture material. Else, I don't know what might happen to you.
I promise.
Several years ago, I read a book called A Dweller on Two Planets. The man who did the physical writing claimed that one whom he called the Master stood by his shoulder and dictated the entire book. I checked into the thing and found that the author was only a young boy at the time the work was done. He would have hardly had the necessary experience to write such a book. So I investigated further.
I've read the book, written by Philos.
Yes. Well, I also saw an article printed in a prominent metropolitan daily. The writer had gone to the slopes of Mount Shasta and had discovered there the same type of people that Philos had written of in his Dweller on Two Planets.
Seems to me that I read something in the Times about strange, unaccountable lights being seen from the region of Mount Shasta.
Right. And so, all in all, and being a newspaper man and of an inquisitive turn of mind, I went there.
You did?
Yes. I got to Dunsmuir in Northern California about 10 in the morning. Soon after, began making my way towards the slopes of Mount Shasta. I had a strange feeling, a feeling of expectancy. There was a deep silence, except for the singing of birds and the sound of a waterfall. I'd been sitting on a rock, oh, I don't know how long, when...
My son, do you seek knowledge?
What? Where are you?
At your side.
Oh, now I see you. What was that you said?
It is of no matter. You are a newspaper man?
Yes, I am.
But you would also seek the truth?
Well, to be quite frank, I read quite a bit about the masters of Mount Shasta, and I wanted to find out for myself.
That was known to us. I have come here to speak with you.
Yes?
Certain things will be disclosed to you, but you must not use these disclosures in your newspaper work. For the benefit of mankind, you may use them, but for profit, no. It is a testament between us.
Ladies and gentlemen, inasmuch as any solution must of necessity be supposition, liberties of time, place, and characters have been taken in this solution for which you have been waiting. Well, Bill, what about that explanation?
In the first place, do you think it's possible to think of the impossible?
Let me see if I follow you. Can I imagine the impossible? No, I don't believe I can. The very fact that I can think of something makes that something possible.
If you believe in the power of mind over matter...
Well, as far as I'm concerned, mind is all-powerful.
Now let's look at biology for an instant. Every so often, a specimen is found that is a definite link between some animal alive today and some other animal that's been extinct for centuries.
I see your drift. You mean that these people are a link between us and some long-dead people who possess powers we don't know how to use?
Yes. If you read Colonel Churchward's book on Mu, you will find logical arguments in favor of the theory that the Lemurians migrated to the North American continent.
And that some of them landed to the south and became the ancient Mayas.
Right. And the ancient Mayas certainly had something that we don't possess, as did the ancient Egyptians.
Yes, we're all too inclined to think of America as a land inhabited by nothing but warlike Indians before it was settled.
Only the other day, a skeleton was found near the La Brea pits in Los Angeles, and scientists are agreed that it's not less than 15,000 years old. So isn't it possible that descendants of these ancient peoples still live in isolated parts of the country?
And not liking our modern civilization, they simply withdraw from it?
That's it. After my experience, you can hardly blame me for believing that a strange people do live on the slopes of Mount Shasta.
The preceding were portions of a radio show from 1936 entitled Unexplained Mysteries of Mount Shasta. Strangely, the radio show hit on many of the themes and mythologies of Mount Shasta that would come to be part of the I Am activity and that had already been developed as part of theosophical thought, thus also matching the Native American mythology of Mount Shasta. So as we will see, this theme progresses to where we see the legend of J.C. Brown, the story of a mining engineer who came to Mount Shasta and found a tunnel into the mountain. Strangely, the life of J.C. Brown and the dates involved match that of Guy Ballard, who coincidentally is also a mining engineer. In his book, Unveiled Mysteries, Ballard briefly states that he was in the McLeod area on, quote, government business, when he had his encounter with Saint Germain on the slopes of Mount Shasta. So all of these connections are interesting, leading us to the possible assumption that it may be that Guy Ballard and J.C. Brown are indeed the same person. There's scant evidence true, they're both mining engineers, but they both lived during the same era and passed away at the same time. Later we'll see some of these same coincidences applying to the mystery of the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto. One must emerge from the underworld to quest for the stone. Perhaps Pluto's cave near Mount Shasta is such a place. Many of the myths and legends of Mount Shasta are reflective of both the Native American myths of the mountain and European stories that involved the man in the mountain. Rulers as early as Charlemagne applied a mystery to where their remains were hidden that may have been solved by up to 3 subsequent Holy Roman Emperors, including Frederick Barbarossa and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Here in Northern California, we see these very concepts being applied in a slightly different way that reflects American values. Here in the following story of the legend of J.C. Brown, we may see Rosicrucian overtones, references to the Book of Mormon and the Golden Tablets, giants in America, and much more. And remember, in episode 1, we saw how Joseph Smith was related to John Bidwell and Henry Steele Olcott, as well as Guy Ballard, and all of these men seem to have a great impact on the development of the value of Mount Shasta the way we see it today. Here in the following story of the legend of J.C. Brown, in Emily Frank's book, Mount Shasta, California's Mystic Mountain, we will see many of these concepts displayed. The strange story of J.C. Brown may reveal a lot about Mount Shasta.
Everyone loves a mystery, especially a mystery about Mount Shasta. There have been many fascinating myths and legends written about this Northern California giant, and who is to know which are based on fact and which are pure fiction? The solitary mountain simply slumbers on, her secrets intact. But ever so often another mysterious story surfaces, a new cast of characters emerge, and attention is centered once more on the mystic mountain. That's the way it has been for years and probably will always be. The leading character in the following tale is a baffling man by the name of J.C. Brown, who in 1904 was employed with the Lord Cowdray Mining Company of London, England. He was hired to prospect for precious metals in this gold-bearing region, and while here, he ran onto a section of rock in the face of a cliff which didn't seem to match the surrounding formation. While examining the curious stone, he noticed it blocked the entrance to what appeared to be a cave. Brown, a geologist, thought the entire scene was unnatural and began to dig out the mouth of the cave, which was full of debris and vegetation. He began to see that it was not a small cave, and after much digging found himself in a tunnel which curved downward into the mountain. Equipped with lanterns and miners' paraphernalia, he set out to explore. 3 miles from the mouth of the tunnel, I struck a cross-section containing a gold-bearing ore, and farther on I struck another cross-section where an ancient race apparently had mined copper, he said later. He believed the other cross-sections outcropped on some other part of the mountain. The decline continued, and approximately 11 miles inside the mountain he found what he called the village. He discovered 2 rooms filled with copper and gold tablets, about 3 by 4 inches and concave, so that one was laid inside the other. The rooms were literally full of these plates, all inscribed neatly. And that's not all he found. The walls were lined with tempered copper and hung with shields of wall pieces made of gold. On some of the gold plates he found were engraved certain drawings and hieroglyphics. There were tempered copper spears and other objects made of gold. Rooms opened into other chambers, one of which appeared to have been a place of worship. In addition, there were 13 statues made of copper and gold and a large sun design from which protruded golden streamers. The way the objects were strewn about, he had the feeling the occupants of the underground village had left on the spur of the moment. And then he came upon a macabre scene. In one chamber he counted 27 skeletons, the smallest of which was 6 feet 6 inches tall, and the largest stretching out more than 10 feet. 2 of the bodies were mummified, each clad in colorful, ornate robes. Brown spent days exploring, studying the hieroglyphics, and indelibly imprinting them in his mind. He was excited about this great archaeological find and decided to leave the tunnel and its contents exactly as he had found them. He would return. But first he cleverly concealed the entrance of the tunnel and marked it on his map exactly where it was on the mountain. The next 3 decades, those spanning 1904 to 1934, Brown's activities seem to be shrouded in mystery, but it is known that he studied the literature and philosophy pertaining to the lost continent of Mu and the lost Lemurian civilization, among other lore of prehistoric races. Years of study and comparison of the hieroglyphics and pictographs found in the tunnel convinced him that they were indeed records of the Lemurian race. And so, after 30 long years, Brown surfaced. He decided that the golden artifacts still hanging untouched in the cavern in the mountain and the glory of those Lemurians should be shared by others. In 1934, at the age of 79, Brown appeared in Stockton, California. His idea was to organize a group of people interested in accompanying him, at his expense, to Mount Shasta, and once there, they would explore further the ancient tunnel he had found in 1904. 80 eager Stockton residents, including a newspaper editor, a museum curator, a retired printer, several scientists, and other solid citizens, formed a group to investigate the tunnel with J.C. Brown. They met nightly for 6 weeks to plan the expedition, and also to listen to Brown's fabulous tales of lost continents, hieroglyphics, and the enticing descriptions of the treasure which seemed to be just within their grasp. Some even gave up their jobs, and some sold much of their personal property during those 6 weeks. So certain were they that their lives would be altered and enriched after their remarkable discoveries. The editor and the curator questioned Brown closely, going over and over the details of his bizarre story. Brown disclosed that he had spent much of the previous 30 years searching for ancient records pertaining to the Lemurians, and his mental picture of the hieroglyphics in the tunnel village had convinced him that he had found the lost link in the story of civilization. And he told them he believed the golden antiquities he had found were those of the Lemurians or their descendants. Brown even promised to provide a yacht to transport the group as far north as they could go by water. They would leave on June 19th at 1 p.m. The day dawned clear and beautiful, and 80 Stockton citizens were waiting at the designated time for their leader to appear. They had met the evening before in order to consummate the final details, after which J.C. Brown bid them adieu until the next afternoon. However, Brown was never seen by the group again, and what happened to him is anybody's guess. The members of the group feared for his life. He had mentioned that he had once been kidnapped and had barely escaped with his life. They called in the Stockton police, but no trace of the man was found. He had completely disappeared. But the 80 persons who waited in vain for him that June day believed the authenticity of his story, and they believed in the existence of the vast tunnel in Mount Shasta filled with golden artifacts. Unfortunately, J.C. Brown had never revealed the exact location of the secret tunnel in the mountain, and it is highly probable that these treasures of a prehistoric era will never again delight the eyes of another human. Wreathed in clouds and mist and sealed throughout the ages in ice and snow, Mount Shasta keeps her secrets to herself, as always.
Many of these stories of Mount Shasta have similar elements to them, starting with a dweller on two planets, leading us to the legend of J.C. Brown and more. Even the radio show we heard excerpts of from earlier was made in the 1930s at about the time the legend of J.C. Brown was taking part. Here we will see many of those elements present in the Native American myth of Mount Shasta.
The Indians say the Great Spirit made this mountain first of all. Can you not see how it is, they say? He first pushed down snow and ice from the skies through a hole which he made in the blue heavens by turning a stone round and round, till he made this great mountain. Then he stepped out of the clouds onto the mountain top and descended and planted the trees all around by putting his finger on the ground. Simple and sublime. The sun melted the snow, and the water ran down and nurtured the trees and made the rivers. After that he made the fish for the rivers out of the small end of his staff. He made the birds by blowing some leaves which he took up from the ground among the trees. After that he made the beasts out of the remainder of his stick, but made the grizzly bear out of the big end, and made him master over all the others. He made the grizzly so strong that he feared him himself, and would have to go up on the top of the mountain out of sight of the forest to sleep at night, lest the grizzly, who, as will be seen, was much more strong and cunning than now, should assail him in his sleep. Afterwards, the Great Spirit, wishing to remain on earth and make the sea and some more land, he converted Mount Shasta by a great deal of labor into a wigwam, and built the fire in the center of it and made it a pleasant home. After that his family came down, and they all have lived in the mountain ever since. They say that before the white man came, they could see the fire ascending from the mountain by night and the smoke by day, every time they chose to look in that direction.
So we see some similarities between the Native American myth of the mountain and the legend of J.C. Brown, also related to a kind of Rosicrucian belief of the man in the mountain of Charlemagne. Next, in the story of the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto, we'll also see some similarities, but we may be actually seeing some real physical clues that may lead us to the conclusion that some of the same people that were involved in the famous Rennes le Chateau mystery in France may have also been involved in the Frenchman's Tower, and indeed what is suggested is that a man in the mountain myth is present at Mount Shasta. In some ways, this myth implies that exiled French king Henri V is interred in a crypt somewhere in the Mount Shasta area. Although this is a far-out story, this may be what the myth is meant to imply. Another possible candidate for entombment in a hidden crypt somewhere in the Mount Shasta area could be Saint Germain. And Saint Germain, the actual physical person, not necessarily the theological, mythological figure. We do see relationships to the German and Scottish Stuart family that had a great deal to do with the development of the United States, and especially as we keep seeing these connections to the themes of the Republic and the Society of Cincinnati, which also involved French and American elements, as this organization was comprised of military officers who had served in the Revolutionary War and their descendants. So here, let's examine the Frenchman's Tower and see what relations to the man in the mountain we can see.
In the South Bay area of California sits the enigmatic Frenchman's Tower. This simple brick structure has always been somewhat of a curiosity to the local population. As we will see, this simple yet elegant brick tower may lead us on a pathway all the way back to France, Rennes le Chateau, and all the old world values of man in the mountain that we see today at Mount Shasta. It appears the Frenchman's Tower was likely built by the same people that had built the famous Tour Magdala and Villa Bethany at Rennes le Chateau, and had also possibly paid to have the chapel there renovated as we see it today. In the end, we may also see the involvement of the American influence via the Society of the Cincinnati at both places. In 1875, Paul and Caperon moved to what would become Palo Alto, California, and built a premier stock farm on the same land that would become Stanford University. Paul and Caperon was truly a man of mystery. As part of the array of buildings on the Ayrshire farm, he built what is today referred to as the Frenchman's Tower. After a time, it became known that Paul and Caperon's real name was Count Peter Coutts. This name more closely matches the Scottish origins of the name Ayrshire Farm. Strangely possible, Society of the Cincinnati member Edgar Allan Poe also has links to the Ayrshire district of Scotland, and even attended school there for a short while as a young man. The Coutts Bank of London also financed the Chateau Chambord estate of exiled King of France, Henri V. Indeed, it is Henri V who researchers such as Society Perrios of France point to as having funded the construction of the Tour Magdala and Villa Bethania at Rennes le Chateau. The lives of Henri V and Paul and Caperon closely match each other in dates of birth, exile, and death. It appears that Paul and Caperon, aka Peter Coutts, may have even been working in the interest of the exiled king in investing in gold rush era California. Here in the personages of Coutts or Caperon and Henri V, we also see a cast of people that may have valued the establishment of a talismanic prime meridian in the tradition of the man in the mountain myths of Charlemagne, who Henri V was likely related to. There is even a remote chance that Paul and Caperon was indeed Henri V in person. In fact, Henri V was very distantly related to even John Bidwell, the founder of Chico, who we see in turn related to many New Age figures associated with Mount Shasta.
Here's the Frenchman's Tower on Google Earth. Here we'll plot an azimuth or arc on the globe due north from the Frenchman's Tower. As we see, this arc plotted leads to Mount Shasta, just a little bit due west of the peak, or due east of the peak of Mount Shasta. And what we may be seeing here is the intentional creation of a man-in-the-mountain myth by a descendant of Charlemagne, who seemed to have created this myth himself, and had subsequent Holy Roman emperors search for his remains, or search for the hidden crypt or tomb that he had left, thus matching the central core belief in the Rosicrucian order, or Rosicrucian belief, that Christian Rosenkreuz is interred in a tomb in an unknown mountain. This matches the mythology of Charlemagne, and here we maybe see associates of exiled King Henry V establishing the same type of mythology in California. So why is the Frenchman's Tower important? What we may be seeing in the Frenchman's Tower is a kind of European imperial claim to things in California. Somebody had taken the time to suggest that there was a man-in-the-mountain mystery here that was created by a Frenchman. Now, after a time, all, quote, foreigners were banned from California, and this happened to be about the time when Henri V was allowed to return to France when his exile ended. So this is another event in Pauline Caperon's life that matches the events in the life of Henri V. So in response, we may see the kind of Republican ideals of the Society of the Cincinnati answering the man-in-the-mountain myth of Henri V in the form of Joaquin Miller, another artist and author who seemingly went to Europe, associated for a time with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a kind of a artist guild of Europe at the time, dedicated towards supporting the notion that older art had more legitimacy and could be used to communicate modern ideas. We see Miller then returning to Washington, D.C. and living on the White House Meridian in a log cabin for 2 years before returning to Oakland and building his Heights estate due south of Mount Shasta. Now, this includes the Pyramid of Moses and 2 towers, one dedicated to explorer Fremont, and an interesting funeral pyre on which Miller's remains were supposedly actually burned by his Bohemian Club brothers. Alright, we're at Castle Crags. This is right near where Joaquin Miller lived. And in the area there's some strange rock carvings very similar to the ones on his Heights estate in Oakland. This is where Joaquin Miller wrote My Life Amongst the Modocs, that became a big hit in England and sent him on his way as a spy for the Society of Cincinnati in Europe. After he returned, he lived on the White House Meridian in Washington, D.C. for 2 years in a log cabin in what is now Meridian Hill Park. After this, he moved back to Oakland and built his estate, including a pyramid and 2 strange towers due south of the peak of Mount Shasta. So it seems that Joaquin had some talismanic beliefs in the spatial arrangement of monuments in relation to a center axis. The location of Joaquin Miller's estate and the architecture that he built may indicate that he was responding to this kind of imperial notion of the man in the mountain in an intelligence service way. We do see that the Society of the Cincinnati used kind of spies in a kind of a Wild Wild West scenario, referring to the TV show of spies of the 19th century era. So it is clear that countries like England and the United States tried to influence artists and the notion of their countries that was promoted via literature and art. And along with this went folklore. So it appears that Joaquin Miller was aware of what had been done at the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto, and that his estate and architecture was a response to this. And we do see this in many places in California, like the Chico City Plaza, the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose, the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, Hearst Castle, and many other places. At each of these places, it is shown how their builders or the architects were aware of these concepts in this tradition and how it related to mysteries in the old world, related to quests for hidden biblical relics, and again, all the way back to the man in the mountain mythology of Charlemagne and before, and even of the Merovingian dynasty that we see at Rennes le Chateau in France. So in future episodes and in my work, The Prophecy of Dante and the New Jerusalem of Ravenna, we can see how the concept of Arcadia links all the way back to the Byzantine rulers and their Merovingian relatives and wives that kind of morphed into the Merovingian dynasty that Charlemagne is related to, and the Merovingian characters associated with Rennes le Chateau and its man in the mountain mythology of the blood of Christ. So thank you very much for joining me here on episode number 2 of Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, where we see that indeed the mineral riches and political climate of early California did lend itself to imperial interests, and a law was even created in response to eject many of these people from California, including what was considered to be for a long time our French allies. And we see people who were in exile, such as Henry V, the exiled king of France, and those associated with him possibly establishing the Ayrshire farm in Gold Rush, California, and leaving at the same time Henri V's exile was done. So this person who created the farm was associated with Henri V, or was in the same kind of political situation associated with the Franco-Prussian War. Hi, I'm Cort Lindahl. Welcome to this special examination of Mount Shasta, California. We're going to be looking into all the ins and outs and weird and spiritual stories of Mount Shasta right here, right now.
John Muir once said, "Mount Shasta is a cathedral of nature." What is it about this place that inspires spirituality and awe beyond the natural beauty of the mountain? it may be that the origins of many of the more modern ideas about Mount Shasta came from Native American lore. Over the years, these ideas were expanded and added to by people with different spiritual concerns, who in many ways co-opted Native ideas about the mountain. The native lore of Mount Shasta involves the Creator drilling a hole in the sky and the debris becoming Mount Shasta. The mountain was considered his home in a similar manner to how later people may have distorted this concept into including a city hidden in the mountain in the tradition of Shambhala and Argatha in Tibetan lore. Even the much later Nazis valued these concepts to some degree. In tandem with this concept, a series of spiritual movements and strange historical stories have in turn emerged, giving Mount Shasta some of the most well-developed folklore of the modern age. In response, many spiritual movements have popped up in relation to these beliefs, combined with the natural beauty of Mount Shasta. From the native history of the mountain to the more recent stories of cities hidden in the depths of Mount Shasta, there is truly something for everyone with regard to California's mystic mountain.
John Muir once called Mount Shasta a cathedral of nature. And that's really true. If you've ever been to Mount Shasta, you'll know that it gives you kind of this awesome feeling of nature and just natural beauty. So it's easy to understand why over the years spiritual movements have kind of attached themselves to Mount Shasta, giving us interesting stories of the city of Telos beneath Mount Shasta, kind of starting with the book A Dweller on Two Planets, which kind of kicked the whole thing off at the turn of the 20th century, where these concepts kind of were established. And over the years, kind of some New Age and theosophical concerns have developed at Mount Shasta, such as the I Am activity, which values the figure of the Comte Saint-Germain, or Saint Germain, as many people refer to him, as a kind of ascended master, along with the value of Sir Francis Bacon and other significant historical figures in the same milieu as Saint Germain at Mount Shasta. So that's very interesting. Today, the I Am activity occupies what was once the Shasta Springs Resort, which is a nice old historic property where they kind of meet, and a lot of them live even, and people come to visit and vacation there, just as when it was a resort that was open to the public. So the story of Guy Ballard meeting the Saint Germain on the slopes of Mount Shasta, somewhere over on the McLeod side of the mountain, kind of led to this spiritual belief that values, some common Christian theology or beliefs, but also with the addition of Saint Germain as the ascended master, as kind of a Christ-like figure as part of that.
One of the most amazing and well-documented stories about Mount Shasta is known as the Legend of J.C. Brown. The Legend of J.C. Brown is notable because the real-life events surrounding this amazing tale were also recorded in the Stockton Record Searchlight newspaper. Here again, the Legend of J.C. Brown also includes elements of the Mount Shasta story, going all the way back to Oliver's book, A Dweller on Two Planets.
One of the other interesting parts about Mount Shasta, or the lore of Mount Shasta, is the story of J.C. Brown, who told a story, even that was featured in the Stockton newspaper at the time, that he had found a passage that led to beneath Mount Shasta, 11 miles, and that he had found tombs there with mummies in it, high technology like self-heating spaces and rooms that were decorated with golden objects like a treasure story that even had some Mormon overtones to it, with the mention of golden tablets being part of what was found by J.C. Brown. Now, he showed up in Stockton, California after this allegedly actually happened, and convinced a lot of people that it was true, and even arranged a trip to Mount Shasta. And on the morning when he and his team were supposed to leave, he never showed up, thus leaving it a mystery as to any possible truth of the story. Now, over the years, I've looked into the legend of J.C. Brown a great deal. And I think, if we look at it as true, that's your prerogative. But to me, it looks like a story that was kind of contrived along the lines of some of the other interesting stories at Mount Shasta, like the Castle Crags petroglyphs that were also thought to have been associated with Lemuria or a city beneath Mount Shasta, and those kind of turned out to have a more practical or historically viable explanation than that kind of point of view. But I understand that people believe these kinds of things. But there was a man, in fact, his name was Curly Brown, and he's responsible for Mount Shasta City being named that. He kind of led the drive to change the name from Sisson, which was the original name of Mount Shasta City, which I think is kind of cool, that they maybe shouldn't have changed the name, but Curly Brown saw fit to, create a campaign to change the name to Mount Shasta City, and that became the name of the town. Everybody agreed to change the name. So Curly Brown was a horse racing tycoon from the Chicago area who had purchased a large plot of land near Sisson or Mount Shasta City. And Curly was Mormon. This was obvious because he named his sons after some of the famous Mormon saints like Moroni and other names that are popular in Mormon lore and beliefs. So that may be why there was golden tablets included in the story of J.C. Brown. And I suspect there was some connection between Curly Brown and J.C. Brown, at least the use of the name Brown. So that's my take on that, though I understand why people would want to believe such a cool treasure story that kind of has all of the components of what I term man in the mountain mythology.
Tales of UFOs and Bigfoot are common in the Mount Shasta area today. Mount Shasta follows a tradition that goes far back in history that includes the man-in-the-mountain imagery of Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa. These older stories may have influenced the way stories about Mount Shasta developed beginning at the turn of the 12th century.
And that's a European tradition that goes back to Germany and most exemplified during the time of Charlemagne and his descendants, Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, who both displayed tenets of this kind of, that a mystery had been left by Charlemagne that they solved, and it involved a tomb in a mountain with the great treasure associated with the library of information, or things like the Coronation Gospels, which are said in legend to have been part of Charlemagne's tomb when it was found. So this kind of concept later even fed into Rosicrucian lore, the story of Christian Rosenkreuz being entombed in a seven-sided chamber with a hidden library of information and other cloistered information that is kind of a lure that is the basis of many treasure stories that people have come to believe over the years, like Oak Island, the Rennes le Chateau treasure, and others. The Beale treasure all involve a vault, supposed information that's hidden along with the great treasure. So the legend of J.C. Brown is along those lines of a chamber sequestered deep within a mountain, in this kind of tradition that we see that led to a lot of Rosicrucian beliefs even over time. So that's very interesting, and I think it does apply to the story of J.C. Brown at Mount Shasta.
The first real reference to what would become the legend of the city of Telos beneath Mount Shasta comes to us via a book entitled A Dweller on Two Planets by Frederick Spencer Oliver, first published in 1899. A Dweller on Two Planets in many ways established a lore that many others would come to emulate. Interestingly, Oliver's book associates Mount Shasta with Atlanteans and not Lemurians, which would later emerge as the source of all strange goings-on there. The book also seems to promote many theosophical concepts like reincarnation and astral travel. Many of these concepts featured in this book later became mainstays of other ideas about the mystical nature of Mount Shasta. Eventually, others would then speculate that it had been the lost citizens of Lemuria that had established a city beneath Mount Shasta. Both of these concepts, in turn, seem to have also been expressed by the later figure Guy Ballard in his I Am Activity spiritual movement.
So John Muir, as I said, kind of created the notion that Mount Shasta was a cathedral of nature, and there's an interesting connection between the Mount Shasta story and lore and Chico, California, where I live, is home to the Bidwell family. John Bidwell was famous for creating Chico, and he and his wife Annie Bidwell created a unique street plan in Chico that I've talked about before, that I'll be doing another episode about, that's very interesting, that Annie Bidwell was related to Andrew Ellicott, who worked with Pierre L'Enfant to create the street plan of Washington, D.C. So some of her family tradition may have been at play with regard to the street plan of Chico even. But it's interesting that Annie and John Bidwell went on a trip to Mount Shasta with famous botanist J.D. Hooker, John Dalton Hooker, and John Muir. John Bidwell, the founder of Chico, was a good friend of John Muir's, and he visited Chico several times, and one story even has Bidwell building Muir a rowboat that he rowed all the way to Stockton, California on the Sacramento River and associated canals through the Delta region there to the west of Sacramento. So they all went on a camping trip to Sisson, what it was called at the time, in that area of Mount Shasta. And while they were there, it was interesting. J.D. Hooker was a famous botanist. He was the brother-in-law of Charles Darwin, the famous creator of the theory of evolution, or one of the first to espouse that idea in the evolution of humankind. So while they were there, Hooker regaled them with stories of how Mount Shasta reminded him of trips he had already made to Tibet. And so this is a really kind of interesting early connection or suggestion that people would read. This was included in John Muir's personal journal, that people just a little while later in history read, I think including some of the people that came to apply the notion of a city beneath Mount Shasta was based on the stories of Agartha and Shambhala in Tibetan and Indian lore that J.D. Hooker kind of told his friends this story when they were camping out at Mount Shasta. So it's interesting that this is related to the Bidwell family and John and Annie Bidwell, who in turn, as I said, created kind of what seems at first glance a strange street plan that
The influence of the story of Guy Ballard meeting Saint Germain on the slopes of Mount Shasta and drinking a magical elixir suggests stories about the elixir of life, once popular among Rosicrucian and alchemical circles in Europe. The Count Saint Germain was a central figure in 18th century promotion of similar ideas. Indeed, the era during which Ballard made his claims is also near the same time Marie Bauer Hall was making similar claims with regard to the legend of the Broughton Vault in Williamsburg, Virginia. Both stories involve the concept of a ascended master, as well as other concepts related to theosophical points of view. In this way, there is no coincidence that Saint Germain is also associated with magical goings-on at Mount Shasta. The IM activity was inspired by Guy Ballard's view of Saint Germain as an ascended master. These beliefs then also came to be associated with other significant historical figures, such as Sir Francis Bacon, who is also considered an ascended master.
Mount Shasta just is a mystical place that you can't help but be enchanted by. I use that word, and it's just an interesting place to visit, no matter your beliefs. The natural beauty there is just awesome, and it does inspire spiritual beliefs in people. And I've often noted before, having worked in the Mount Shasta area quite a bit over the years, that on all sides of it, all around the mountain, there you can begin to recognize where you are just by what the mountain looks like from that point of view. So I can see how native people would even use it as a kind of navigational aid to some degree, to tell which direction you had to go to get to where you wanted, because you knew the view from there didn't match where you wanted to go. So that's an interesting kind of thing that goes back to a value of kind of the axis mundi, or the spiritual center of native lore, which all of the seemingly New Age lore that's come out of Mount Shasta resembles the original Native American myths of how the Creator created the mountain by drilling a hole in the sky, and the debris became the mountain, which he fashioned into his wigwam or home. So it's interesting that even the later colonial or Western beliefs came here, and they still adapt this strange attachment to a city in the mountain, or somebody living in the mountain.
All of these stories in relation to Mount Shasta have in turn created a modern version of some of the theories and lore in the current era. There are many people who take these stories literally. One more recent concept is that the city of Telos beneath Mount Shasta is present in another dimension, and that one must access the portal to visit Telos. Strange stories about Mount Shasta are continually being added to, including one recent story of a man encountering a person who he claims was a Lemurian from the hidden city of Telos beneath Mount Shasta. The gentleman in question also claims that a portal opened in the mountain and he was taken on a tour of Telos by his Lemurian guide. In addition to all of the other myths and legends of Mount Shasta, the mountain has also become what may be termed a UFO hotspot. Many people claim to see strange lights on and around Mount Shasta. Some theories involve the frequent appearance of lenticular clouds over the mountain being a shield or way to hide the coming and goings of extraterrestrial craft.
So that about wraps it up for now. Thanks for joining me on this brief look at Mount Shasta, the myths and legends associated with this grand place. And please see my 4-part series about Mount Shasta that goes into a lot more detail, with each part being at least a half-hour long. So I look at all the different history and views and everything that seems to have created the mythology of Mount Shasta, and took an objective view of this too, and also give you real historical events that may have caused people to believe these things, or the spiritual movements that were prevalent during different parts of American history, even going back to the Hudson's Bay Company, who used to claim the region where Mount Shasta is, and other parts of California like San Francisco and Stockton as well. So there's a lot of early influence with people like Sir Francis Drake, even early on, claiming New Albion, which is parts of California, Oregon, and Washington, for England.
We hope you enjoyed this look into the myths and lore of Mount Shasta. We will continue to look for more interesting stories as related to California's Mystic Mountain. For a more in-depth look into the myths and legends of Mount Shasta, see Cort Lindahl's 4-part series on this subject. For other views, see the work of Stephan Sindoni and Dustin Naif. Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more videos on lost treasures, odd history, and more. Thank you.